This month, we honor Toni Morrison and her groundbreaking book, Beloved. Last week, we heard from Dr. Valerie Smith, who reminded us that we should confront the atrocities of our past to build a better future. This week, our guest speaker is Allison Bass-Riccio. Allison will speak about trauma, healing from trauma, and exploring her grief process through Toni Morrison's Beloved. Allison Bass-Riccio currently serves as department chair and teacher of English literature at Cheshire Academy, a boarding school in Cheshire, Connecticut. Allison is also the author of an article titled A Near Emotional Drowning, Exploring the Personal Grief Process through the Lens of Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved. Before we begin, I want you to remind you to check our NEA Big Read calendar of events, which can be found on our website for more programs on Beloved. Without further ado, here's Allison.
Thank you so much for inviting me into this space and for coming to hear me talk tonight about a really personal subject. And I want to ask everyone to be here with your open mind and your open heart and try to be vulnerable and authentic in this space with me as I am with you. So when we're talking about something that is so vulnerable, such as grief, it's really important to discuss who you are and where you come from. And so this picture here is of me at age 17 with my 8-month-old daughter. We're living in Southern Appalachia, and you can see our trailer right behind us. And I think this really demonstrates a lot about where I have been and where I am now and where I'm going in the future. You can see the other picture is a more present picture of myself. And it is me within the past few years. Here I am as still a mom. My daughter's 22 years old. She is working on her social work degree. And I'm also now a wife, a stepmom, a teacher, and department chair. And I'm going to talk to you a lot today about some experiences that I've had over the past decade that were really founded and shaped by reading Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved. So you might be wondering how I came to write this. And actually, it started out as my master's thesis. And turned into something so much more than that. As I was beginning my master's thesis, I was searching and researching about motherhood in Toni Morrison's novel. And really, as I wrote this, it became a foundation for my life, for who I am, and really how I view my world around me, how I approach my relationships, how I approach my teaching, and my parenting. So I first read Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved, back in my early 20s when I was working on my undergrad degree at Western Carolina University. And this quotation meant so much to me at that time, and it still does today. And it became a quotation to ground my life in, the idea of loving thickly, loving immensely, loving with my full heart. But of course, when you love thickly like that, you are taking an inherent risk. You're taking a risk on the idea of being able to lose that person, to lose that love that you have that's so intense. And anytime you love thickly like that and you experience a loss, then the grief can often be quite nebulous. And so when I set out to write about this, I knew I really needed to make some intentional and deliberate decisions. And so I made these decisions early on in the process. And the first decision that I made was to work on blurring genres. And so, of course, as many master's theses are, I worked to critically analyze the Toni Morrison's novel. And so I worked to look at that quasi-historical aspect. But past that, I started to analyze my own grief. And I started to think about how my grief was a representation of some social norms as well. And so I wrote about my grief in the text in a memoir style writing. And then I went for one step past that and looked at the social psychoanalysis of grief, particularly in America. And I would be remiss if I didn't take a chance to say that I really needed to make sure I separated my experience from Setha, the main character's experience in Beloved. And I needed to do that because while I'm saying that I did see some similarities between her experiences and mine, I am in no way claiming that her trauma and her grief was the same as mine or was anywhere like that. And I know I need to claim that privilege as a 21st century white woman and understand that there were much more complexities around that grief. And in order to do so in my writing, I intentionally used font and text in a very deliberate way. And so what I did was I used different sections to separate my experience from Setha's experience and to use even different font. So I wrote my entire memoir style experience in italics. Again, after that, I went on to analyze some of the social norms that Setha and myself might have experienced. And then from there, I carried the water analogy, the water metaphor into my text and used water as a way to discuss really powerful emotions. Ultimately, my hope is that the reader can see that even though I'm not claiming Setha and I have the same experience, I hope that the reader can see that there are some similarities, and grief supersedes time and space and race and institutions. And in fact, we can claim that grief is a universal process. And so let me stop there and say that I'm not saying every grief experience is the same. What I'm saying is that most of us who live on this earth will experience grief at some place in time in our lives. And even though you may have lost your father and I may have lost my father, those experiences are not going to be exactly the same, but there may be some similarities throughout those. Indeed, bereavement customs are going to differ from culture to culture, space to space, and even family to family. But in America, I believe that we see Americans often view grief as a negative emotion. It seems like we try to shame it or isolate ourselves from it. And I don't agree with that. I think that anyone who has experienced grief could certainly claim and understand that grief is a devastating feeling, and it's a feeling of despair. But it doesn't mean that it's bad or that it's negative. In fact, it's a part of our life cycle, and it's a part of what makes us human, and it's a teacher in our lives. It's really important to me that I take a moment to ground this presentation in honoring and bringing in the memory of Margaret Garner. So Margaret Garner is the real human being who Toni Morrison was inspired to write after reading about. And Margaret Garner was a woman who was enslaved, and she escaped from her plantation. And in her words, when she was tried to be taken back, she says, "I would rather murder my child than have them go back into slavery and be murdered by piecemeal." And I just want to take a second to honor her and ground this presentation in her presence. So this illustration is from Joe Morse, and it's a beautiful illustration from the illustrative version of Beloved. And we see here the main character, Setha. And Setha has her 4 children with her. And Setha was an enslaved woman who escaped the Sweet Home plantation. And she travels to Ohio, and she lives there free for 28 days. And she lives there in bliss, freedom, happiness, community, support. But because of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1855, the person who owned the plantation, ironically named schoolteacher, comes to Ohio to take her back into slavery. Sethe attempts to murder all 4 of her children, and she has time to succeed in the murder of killing her second youngest daughter. Again, my grief experiences are nothing like Sethe's. My losses are nothing like Sethe's, but it's important that I tell you about my own losses in order for you to understand how reading Beloved helped me to process and move through those griefs. So this picture is a picture of my fiance, and I lost him in 2006. His name was Ryan. I was 23 at the time, and he died a month and a day before our wedding. It was very unexpected. And my daughter, who was 6 years old at the time, was with him when he died. I came home from work. I found him dead there with her by his side. As you might imagine, this was the most traumatic of my loss experiences. My second loss occurred 2 years later when I lost my brother. He was 19 years old at the time, and he died from a drug overdose. And I would have to say this is probably the deepest loss I experienced, because not only was he my only sibling, but he also was my best friend, and he was clearly suffering from mental health issues at the time. And my third loss occurred about a year and a half later, when I lost my father unexpectedly to diabetes. And I say unexpectedly because even though we knew he had diabetes, we believed his condition to be stabilized at the time. We thought that he was in a stable place. So his death was unexpected to me and my family. So after I discuss Sethe's losses and my losses, I want to go on and explain how I see the character Beloved. And so as a high school teacher teaching this for many years, this is the question that everyone who reads it wants to know: what or who or how is Beloved? And I always say to my students, just step back and don't try to figure it out. It's okay. It's okay not to know. But I personally believe that Beloved is grief incarnated. It's Sethe's grief come to life, physically manifesting in her life. And when Sethe first sees the character Beloved, that she's sitting there on a stump in her yard, waiting kind of for her to come into the yard. And we can see that the way that she traveled there could be seen as a way of traveling through grief. She's described as coming from a dark place, from a place of fear, from a place of confusion. And we can certainly understand how that might be someone traveling through a grief process. Indeed, Baby Suggs says right in the beginning of the novel that there's no house in the country that's not filled with grief. And Baby Suggs is Sethe's mother-in-law. And in the beginning of the book, they seem to think that the house is haunted in some way. And they call the person who's haunting the house, they call that person the crawling already ghost. But it seems later on in the novel that when Beloved, the character, shows up, that the ghost has somehow transformed perhaps into grief, and grief manifested physically. We're going to talk a little bit more about Paul D in a second, but Paul D, once he leaves the house, once Sethe is there with the physical manifestation of Beloved by herself, we see Sethe's grief, Beloved, swell to a to a higher degree, to an overwhelming degree, so much so that it is taking over her mentally, physically, and emotionally. It's changing the way that she herself understands the world and can even live in the world. And there's no boundaries between Setha and Beloved. And Beloved knows all of her memories. Beloved is almost just an extension of her, of Setha, actually. And I want to make it really clear that grief and loss is not just a single event. So there's often the first tragic event of losing someone. And then we see secondary losses that follow. Secondary losses that compound the grief and that make the grief much stronger and make the griever stuck in a grieving process. And the secondary losses can come from a multitude of places. And one of those ways is the factor of the loved one's death, the way the loved one died. So if they died in a way that was violent or unexpected, we might see that secondary loss come about. If the person is experiencing a series of multiple losses, they might experience higher degrees of secondary losses. And actually, if you feel that your loved one has had a lack of a fulfilling life, so if you feel that the person who's passed away has not lived their full life, whether it's because they're younger or had mental health issues, or in the case of Setha, her child was enslaved, then you might feel that secondary loss. You're grieving not only their life, but the life they could have had. And we all know that trauma overtakes memories and can change the way that you experience memories. So you might have one memory that's extremely vivid and one memory that you can't quite recall. You might have a fog over other memories. And so losing control over your memories is another type of secondary loss. So often we have complex relationships that are born out of grief. So if you and I both have a relationship with a loved one and that loved one passes away, that can cause our relationship to change or become more complex. And because of that, we could be mourning the loss of the loved one, but also the way in which our relationship has changed. And we all understand that when a person passes away and we come to realization that that is a permanent thing, no matter what our age is, there's a sense of a loss of innocence there. And the two most intense and troublesome types of secondary losses are the loss of community and social support and the loss of self. So often what happens with a griever is the griever will feel there's no one who could really understand how I'm feeling in this moment. There's no one who could really feel the same as me. And as a result, they might take a step back from their community. Also, again, in America, it seems that we have issues with acknowledging grief as a whole. We want to avoid it. We feel shameful. So while there might be an outpouring of support right after the loss, often a griever begins to feel alone as that year goes on. And another secondary loss that is very tragic and very difficult to move through is the loss of self. And so as a person loses a loved one, we are seeing ourselves change. We understand that we often identify ourselves in relation to other people. So I'm someone's mother, I'm someone's sister, I'm someone's daughter. But if your only sibling dies, are you still someone's sister? It changes the way you see yourself, and that becomes a secondary loss as well. So you can see that as you're grieving that initial loss, the real actual death, you're also grieving these secondary losses. And these losses become overwhelming and really difficult to move through. And I like to compare these losses to aftershocks after an earthquake. So we have, the initial tragic loss, which is like an earthquake, and then we have these aftershocks that are the secondary losses. And those really compound the grief and really, really make us stay stuck in a certain space. And as I mentioned before, isolation is surely the most difficult of all of those secondary losses. And we see this isolation in Morrison's novel. She directly tells us that Setha and Setha's family has not had a visitor in 12 years. And in this case, the community is directly ostracizing her. They're doing that on purpose because they feel judgmental towards her actions. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler, who are two grief experts, talk about how a griever must share their story. The griever has to be able to talk about those difficult things in order for them to move through that portal to the next phase of their grief. They have to be able to share that with others. And so if they're isolated, they're not sharing those with others. But it's natural for humans to need someone to help them through a tough time. And so in Morrison's text, we see that Paul D is that person for Setha. So Paul D comes to Setha's house, which is 124. It's called 124. And he shows up at her house 20 years later after the tragic event. And Setha and Paul D began a relationship with each other. And Setha says to herself, oh, finally, I can take a breath and I can relax for long enough or think for long enough about this and know that Paul D is going to catch me. I'm going to be okay. I finally have the time to think about this loss that I've had. But actually, one person can't heal another person. That's not a healthy expectation to have, and it's not setting a relationship up for success in that situation. And indeed, Paul D is haunted by his own grief. He's traumatized and crying out for help because he is overwhelmed by his own grief. And one of his secondary losses would be that men tend to be socialized to grieve differently. So he's also experiencing his own secondary loss. So it's possible that they could survive together as a relationship, but to actually thrive through that is not plausible for them. It's not something that would work. But what Paul D does is he helps Setha create that space for her to begin to feel that grief. And so after he's there, he gives her some caressing and caring. They go to the carnival for a day of fun. It's then when they come back to the house that beloved, Setha's grief incarnate, is there waiting for them. So it seems to me that Paul D helps Setha create that space for her grief to literally show up. But ultimately, because Paul D is experiencing his own grief, he becomes overwhelmed by beloved and is actually driven out of the house. And so we know Paul D refers to his heart and his grief as his tobacco tin. And he imagines it's a tobacco tin that's rusted and that can't ever be pried open. But actually, beloved, or Setha's grief, rips that open in a very difficult way in the text, and that grief is ripped open, and then he leaves the house, and that's why he's driven away. And similarly, in my life, I had Ryan's brother, Lee, who helped to carry me through that grief and that pain. But he was grieving too, of course. He was grieving immensely his brother. And so we could only shelter each other so much. We could only shelter each other to a point of kind of protecting each other, but not providing that space to move through the grieving process. And there comes a point in someone's life where they have to make a choice about trying to find a way to get to the shore, to get through that pain by making their own raft. And of course, nothing is ever completely individual. So people help prompt that building of the raft. And in Toni Morrison's text, we see that it's actually her grown daughter, Denver, who builds that raft for her and helps to prompt the community. She goes out into the community and says, my mom needs help. I need help. Please find a way to come support us. And that's what prompts the community to come to support Setha and Denver. And funny, in a similar way, my daughter also helped me to build that raft. Now, she was much younger than Denver is in the text, but having her presence in my life made me strive to move through that grief and to help me turn that grief into power, into a source of power in our lives. And I was very fortunate because when I was working on my grad degree, I had a professor who helped to prompt me in my healing process by referring me to a professional. But ultimately, it was the women. It was the women who showed up for Setha to witness her grief. It was the women who came in and carried Setha through that. And it was their amazing, powerful voices that were raised in power and in love and support for Setha that helped to support her through that process. And for me, it was a very intentional act, an intentional act of creating a community of women that were powerful in my life. So this is a slide of some of the amazing women in my life, the community of women that I have cultivated over the past decade going through this grief process. And what's really important here is I'm not just lucky to have these friends. And of course, I'm blessed by their presence every day. That's not what I'm saying. But I intentionally nurtured these relationships and saw this as a way for me to move through my grieving process. And now I'm in a place where I can nurture others as well. And so again, it was the women who came. They came with the idea of exorcising beloved out of Setha's life. And what's interesting is when they arrived into the yard of 124, what they saw was themselves. They saw themselves younger, powerful, more happy. They saw themselves in a place where they could indeed take on this grief and really help to move Setha in that place. And what I love about this text is that Morrison could have ended it there, and that would have been a great ending, right? Setha's miraculously healed. We see her living happy. The women helped her, and everything's over. But actually, the next chapter, Setha's in bed, right? And she's nurturing that grief. She's feeling that grief. She's moving through the grieving process because Morrison understood that that's not how grief works. Grief doesn't just end one day because you have friends to help you through it. It is a place, having that community gives you the space to move through it, but it doesn't just miraculously end there. And because she has this space, Paul D can come back, and he does. And they're able to sort of build another type of relationship, a relationship that's healthy rather than codependent. And for me, I had to learn how to take that risk again. I had to learn how to take the risk to love thickly. And by creating that community and being vulnerable and sharing my burdens, I was able to do that. So as I said in the beginning of my presentation, I grounded my life in the idea of loving thickly, starting in my early 20s. Now I'm in my late 30s, and I really am trying to ground my life and reminding myself every day that I am my own best thing. And by doing that, I'm able to advocate for myself. I'm able to use the community that I need to move forward and to create space for others and to help lift others up. So you might be wondering, where am I now? And again, I want to point out that grief is a forever process. It's not something that ends. It's something that becomes a part of you. But because I created that community and chose to move through that pain and grief rather than avoid it, I've created space in my life for new love, new passions, new growth. And so you can see here at the top a picture of my blended family. Just got married 3 years ago. And so you can see I have his extended family down here on the bottom. Big Italian family, very different from how I grew up. And I get to have their presence in my life all the time. Lee and I are still very close. We have a healthy, wonderful relationship. And I'm able to follow my passions. So I'm able to have space in my heart and in my brain to follow things that I really care about, such as Hazel Hawthorne, an unknown writer who lived in the dune shacks of Provincetown from the 1920s until about the 1990s. So you might be wondering, wow, I really see that community is needed for a griever. And you might be saying to yourself, how can I help someone who's going through a grieving process? And so the first thing I would encourage you is to not forget the griever after the traditional mourning ceremonies. Again, we see an outpouring of love and support generally right in the beginning. But honestly, that grief only grows more intense as the year and sometimes years go by. So being sure to reach out to them as those months go by. Make yourself available to talk or to help them with even mundane tasks like mowing the lawn or doing their dishes. Be sure to respect the griever's privacy. So it's easy to tell, or we should be able to tell, the difference between a person who needs privacy to process their grief and a person who's isolating themselves. So allow that space for that person to grieve when they need their privacy. Educate yourself about grief. I can't stress this enough. Americans often don't know how to respond to a grieving process. Americans often feel like they are going to avoid that or make someone feel sad if they bring something up, when in reality, the person feels sad already. So just go ahead and educate yourself about that. Don't be afraid to suggest that the griever receive help or build a community of support. But I want to be careful here. You want to be thoughtful about the timing of that. Okay, so much like my professor did, he helped me by helping me realize I needed help and support. But that was 6 months to a year after one of my losses. You don't need to show up the day after and demand that they go to therapy. Remember the griever around important holidays or times. And this one, I think, is one of the most important. Be willing to sit with the griever in their pain without trying to fix it, without trying to make them feel better. Understand that being able to just sit in that pain is actually what the griever needs in that moment. Don't try to make them think that, the person's in a better place or they lived a good life, those types of things. Let them be sad. It's a sad situation. And finally, learn to change your attitude about grief. Stop thinking of it as a negative emotion and realize that it's an uncomfortable experience that is part of our life cycle, that is part of our process. It's something that makes us more human and makes us connected in the end. So we've discussed some pretty heavy topics today, and I wanted to end on this note. About 3 years before Toni Morrison died, I got to go to New York and see her speak. And she was actually reading from a novel that she was writing at the time, which, she was well into her 80s. And of course, because she's Toni Morrison, she's still writing novels in her 80s. But she was funny and she was charismatic and she was beautiful. And she helped me to reaffirm my foundations of life, to love thickly and to remember that I am my own best thing. So again, I really want to thank you for inviting me here, Elizabeth. Thank you for taking the time to organize this. Thank you for being here in this space and being vulnerable in this space with me and listening to some of my experiences and how I really processed my grief through understanding and reading Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved. Are there questions?
So I found it interesting, Allison, how you sort of connected the story of Beloved and made some connections to your life and to your own grieving process. I thought that was really very interesting. Have you read any of other Morrison novels? And what is your feeling on the best work?
Well, I have to say Beloved is my all-time favorite piece of writing ever in the whole world, the entire universe, the history of writing in general. But of course, I'm biased in that way. But yes, I absolutely have read other texts by Toni Morrison. I actually own all of her texts. And I would have to say that I do see often a thread of grief or loss or pain or trauma and dealing with that throughout many different texts. One of my favorite other pieces that she wrote was Song of Solomon. And we see she does address the idea of grieving differently and that secondary loss I mentioned earlier when a male is grieving and how that being socialized as a man to grieve differently and how that might affect the grieving process. Anything else? Well, again, thank you so much for allowing me to be here and for allowing me to share such a personal and vulnerable experience. Thanks. Thank you, everyone.